let's try that. Okay, so now it looks like it's recording. You know, we never really got into a whole lot of the more advanced logical concepts in GM2, but one that's important is called nonlinearity. And that idea is that things assume different significance given the framework upon which that they're analyzed in. And to look at a mask being put on a person's face as simply being to protect them from infection looks at it from one perspective, which is how effective is that mask as a filtration device. The nonlinear part is that everything assumes a different perspective altogether if you're actually surrounded by a bunch of people who wear masks, then everything changes. The nonlinear part is that actually at that point, the roughly 25% chance that the mask will give you protection is converted to an almost 95% chance that the mask will give you protection simply by being surrounded by all sorts of other people wearing masks, because here you're getting a doubling effect, right? You're getting the effect of the filtration that's coming by virtue of you, and you're getting the effect of the fact that people are filtering their expirational gases as well. Anybody who was logical would be able to look to see that the government advice on this was just terrible. And it was unscientific, and it was really so transparently about their worries that people were going to run out and buy N95 masks and take them away from healthcare workers. But they simply neglected to say, you know, and I said this on one of the conference calls I did with Scientific Affairs. If you look at the way the 1918 pandemic actually managed to actually end, it was through the widespread adoption of masks. And the standard guideline for the mask that was adopted was 6 layers of cheesecloth. Anybody looked at cheesecloth recently? I mean, it's a very, very porous substance. So the idea here was that, you know, we had a government advice there. We had calculations now saying that if the shelter-in-place advice had been given a week earlier, it is estimated that it would have saved between 15 and 20,000 lives. So the mere fact that it took them that extra week to simply come to the conclusion that social distancing and self-quarantine and social isolation, the difference is measured in tens of thousands of graveyards. So what was the big thing that actually changed at least the course of the illness from the dire prognostications that they had with regard to the awareness one day that all of a sudden this thing was already in the country and we had, as you're well aware of, we had a faulty CDC test. The reagent didn't work. We had tests that we could have gotten, for instance, easily from Italy, Germany, South Korea, and China that the CDC rejected because they hadn't been FDA approved. Okay, so here's here's the comedy of errors. So no testing for the longest period of time. We have the world's greatest healthcare system, quote unquote, and biomedical powerhouse is driving without its headlights on at this point in terms of being able to make any sense of the scope, the depth, and the seriousness of this pandemic. You have the World Health Organization, who doesn't want to basically irritate the Chinese, so they don't even call a pandemic. They simply say, we don't use that term anymore. So now you're looking at this situation, but the interesting thing that I thought was most profound, I'm going to just close the door. Is that the American public, and to a certain degree the public of the other countries, outperform their healthcare services. Because you probably were aware that, you know, a week or so before people got the official memo to start isolating and sheltering in place, people were already adopting that behavior. Certainly I knew around where I was in Connecticut, most people were already becoming a little bit more careful about where they were finding themselves. So that's the paradoxical thing, is that the weird part about this pandemic is that the actual public has actually been on average a week or two ahead of the governmental agencies, which tells you a certain degree about what the future could be like and the limitations of the current medical model. But as I look at it, is, you've had way too much philosophy, I'm sure. But, one of the things, and you're all very young, and some of you probably weren't even born back in 1984, 1985. And by the way, if you all have a question or you want to just ask me something or say what you want this conversation to go, please do. Can you all talk okay? I mean, I didn't mute anybody, did I? You're all good, right?
Yeah, we could talk.
Good. So, you have a new disease for which there is no treatment. And you have an unknown degree of penetration into society. And the medical model says that we have to, and I'm talking about HIV now. Okay, I'm talking about AIDS. This is 1980 something. The medical model is, we need to have these antivirals. They need to be tested, placebo controlled. And this is all good. It's all very, very logical stuff. Except the time frame is going to result in most of the people who are currently inflicted not being alive long enough to benefit from the results of the study. So how do you address the needs of these people who in the short term are going to require more of an ad hoc approach when the whole medical infrastructure is based upon going down this research model that's going to take anywhere from, a year or two. And then basically, we've talked about this also in the past, but it's another side story. So this led to something called ACT UP, which was largely a gay-driven agenda to fast track. And guess who was the major guy who was stonewalling a lot of that back then? Anthony Fauci. So you have a situation here where 30 years later, 40 years later, the system still responds in this kind of creaky, antiquated manner, despite the fact that we're now being presented again with a new disease, with an unknown clinical course in the long term, with no effective treatments and no effective testing in the early stages. We hadn't learned a thing. So then you look and you say to yourself, okay, well, and I know for me, when we got to about, I'd say around, I would think it might have been January 10th or so, and that's when I started thinking people in astronaut suits walking down streets in China just didn't look really, it didn't look really like reassuring to me. And then you thought to yourself, okay, but everybody here seems to act like this is no big deal. And yet they're actually having conniptions over there. I mean, you could see videos of them, spraying the streets down and having, all this kind of people dying. And everybody seems so blasé about it, as if somehow or another it was never going to get here. And they probably know this now, but even the models that were like, well, coming from China, it turns out all this stuff in the tri-state area came from Europe. That particular viral strain that basically is killing all the New Yorkers came from Europe. So it can tell you that, a virus can be halfway around the world before the public health system gets their pants on. So this is a situation we find ourselves now. And yet, you look at the whole Chinese experience, and I'm sure you've gone to clinicaltrials.gov, and you see, here's a trial of remdesivir and vitamin C. Here's a trial of chloroquine in combination with traditional Chinese medicine. None of that's going on here, because at least with the Chinese, they had a kind of an open-minded attitude about, the crisis that was actually taking place, and they wanted to be able to throw things at it to see whether or not some of these things had some value. I mean, there's no trials going on in this country that are looking at TCM or anything like that, or, not even, I mean, there's some places that got into large amounts of arguments and stuff over things like adding zinc to the protocol or vitamin C. So, you know, we have a situation here where, you know, we've got a politicized drug on one hand. We have the antiviral that is from Gilead. What is it, Remdesivir or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And they both didn't do well in the studies that looked at using them in cases of extremis. Okay, so in other words, where the person was receiving oxygen but was starting to decompensate and was going into what would be the very beginnings of the respiratory distress syndrome. And so these drugs were not proving to be, and they still haven't shown a whole lot of efficacy there. Matter of fact, there was some reports I was reading today that showed that in extremity, even the donor plasma doesn't work that good. So, and it probably makes sense, at least to me, because at that point in time, I'm not even sure you're really fundamentally dealing with a viral issue anyway. I mean, you're dealing with the consequences of the virus, but at that point in time, antivirals are not, the removal of the virus may not necessarily be, you know, sufficient. And we looked at some of those things that SARS. So, you know, we have gone into a role here now with social media and with telemedicine and the ability to reach large audiences with information. My website and then some of the blogs I've been writing, it's clear that, you know, we occupy a wonderfully helpful, just like in AIDS, a wonderfully helpful niche, but there's no airtime that's being devoted to it, because, you know, if you say to somebody, hey, you know, vitamin D or something like that, of course you get all this kickback from the other medical people and stuff. But the interesting thing is, again, I go back to the premise I started at the beginning, which is the public seems to be ahead of the health experts on these kind of things. So for instance, if you look at what would be a typical adoption process, in other words, if we ran a poll on the Facebook group that I moderate, and we got about, I don't know, 1,500 responses, and it's clear, number one, vitamin C, number two, vitamin D, number three, zinc, number four, elderberry. So if you look at those large numbers of people, at least it's self-selected. In essence, these are the people that were hanging out on my Facebook group. Other things that they were using sort of scaled down from there, but you had, you know, up in the top there, you had quercetin, nettle, melatonin. We'll talk a little bit about some of those. I think it's important. But you have really the two, what I would call early stages. You know, the first stage is really a zero stage. It's kind of a asymptomatic, probably unexposed, okay? So there the strategy is mostly preemptive, mostly preventive. Or what you want to do is canalize, which is one of my favorite words. It means it's trying to get something to go in a direction you'd like it to go into. It has to go in some direction, so maybe you can try to do something to make it go more into your direction than something else. So, you know, it's nice if you don't get it, but if you do get it, you know, how are we going to control the course of it in those intermediate stages, and how are we going to protect against the progression to the next step, which is what I would consider to be, well, you have zero, which is asymptomatic, uninfected, and I say one is an initial influenzal, which is moderately uncomfortable, perhaps some myalgia, some fever, and then would be moderate influenzal, which would be fever, dry cough, and the precipice at that point is dyspnea, which would then, because what's the criteria that's going to put a person in in a hospital situation? So going into a hospital is one thing, going into an ICU is another, and going into ARDS is another. And each one of those scales down appropriately. But generally, the advice that they give is that if a person is having serious difficulty breathing, then they advise you to basically contact the hospital. And at that point, they're usually given a level of oxygen with some nasal cannula type stuff, and could be as little as 3-5%, mostly to assist, being able to keep the saturation levels up. Which actually kind of takes me to an interesting aside here, which you might be reading about in your own studies, which was the notion that the coronavirus displaces heme from the porphyrin setup. This thing got a lot of mileage. And I mean, in functional medicine, they're like, this explains everything. It's almost like this is the major illumination on things. But it doesn't hold water. Okay, so let me explain. And also, I want to say that one of the things I really sort of got back in touch with this was trying to appreciate just how ignorant I am, and how likely I am to want to think something maybe a little too quickly, and how maybe resistant I am to changing my mind once it's made up. So I think this has had a profound effect on me as a thinker, because now I just assume I'm wrong. Go with that. I assume that probably didn't get it right. I assume that perhaps there's going to have to be some change in my approximation of things. So I didn't go into the whole heme thing thinking that I was going to reject it. I would have preferred that I could find strong support for it. That would have made me feel better. But there's a couple of things we have to be aware of with this theory that makes it very difficult to get terribly excited about it. So it goes like this. There's about 21 proteins that basically get coded for in the genome of SARS-CoV-2, which is, I think it's about 32 genes, which seems to be a lot because Ebola has exactly 9 genes. So that manages to kill you in an absolutely elegant fashion. Because if you can think about the fact that you can get a whole lot of stuff like that done with 9 genes, that's pretty darn impressive. But coronaviruses they're more complicated. Their mechanisms of infiltration are much more sophisticated, and so they have. And I can give you the link to this. There was a good article in the New York Times that actually went through each one of the proteins. I don't know if you saw it. It was kind of cool. It had like a little picture of the protein, and then it kind of gave it a nickname. And so you had a lot of these proteins are very well understood. There are fusion proteins. There are proteins that get involved in S spike production. There's proteins that have to do with initiating the first ribosomal activation of the viral RNA, the initial cytoplasmic replication, which is the thing that makes the first series of proteins that then go ahead and start to activate the secondary polymerases. So they know a lot about it. But still, some of these proteins they're kind of mysterious. They even say this is a mystery protein. Paradoxically enough, the proteins that were considered in this New York Times article as being mystery proteins were the very ones that these two researchers in China, were saying they had demonstrated had a predilection for bonding and inactivating the heme protein and causing it to dissociate with the porphyrin. So interesting theory. So it turned out to be ORF3, ORF8, ORF10A. These are the basic proteins. ORF stands for operational reading frame. It's when you know there is a gene there and you don't quite know what it is, so you just give it a generic name like that. So there's bacteria genomes have a huge amount of ORFs because we just don't have a lot of knowledge about what these things do. As soon as we figure out what it is, it makes a convertase or something like that, then it gets a regular name. But a lot of these ORFs are just mystery proteins. So these two researchers in China basically used a program. This was done in silico. So they took these ORF proteins and they ran it through simulations and discovered that the ORF proteins, I think it was 3 and 8, were able to bind to the heme molecule in a certain way that caused it to be structurally inactivated. And this sounded really good, except that if you read the article, it became quite clear that because this was all being done in silico, you could, with almost like a stick shift, throttle up the energy of attraction to be able to make that occur. So the researchers managed to get these ORF proteins to fit heme by literally imploding the attractive energy to the point where if you were going to draw a conclusion down at that level, you could power a nuclear submarine with the amount of energy that they were putting into the study to cause these two molecules to be attracted to each other. So already I struggle with the fact that, hey, if you have to just add so much kinetic energy to make these two molecules bind, you're never going to find that in a biological system. So already the theory is somewhat weak. The second issue has to do with the fact that if the viral proteins are being made and they're inactivating heme, then the amount of viral proteins that are being made is going to be reflective of the total amount of viral particles in the body, and that's a kind of a known factor. It turns out that when you're infected with a virus, you just don't have a lot of virus. If you make a little pile next to the person, it's not a big pile, okay? So how are you going to explain the fact that a total amount of viral particles in the body would have to be 2 or 3 or 4 times the known amount in order for those viral proteins to be able to cause those complications to the heme molecule sufficient to be able to cause the inability of the oxygen saturation to sustain gas transfer. And then finally, look at the red blood cell itself. We have a non-nucleated cell with 0 genetic material. And the viral protein is going to be jettisoned, I guess, as a consequence of the release of the virus. And this virus protein is somehow, either through the virus itself or independently on its own, going to cause a reaction with the surface of the red blood cell such that it penetrates the red blood cell and interacts with the heme molecule. Now, this would be a wonderful thing, because if this was true, it means that you could treat this with transfusions, you could treat this with EPO, right, erythropoietin, any of the growth factor type things. You could treat it with a dye called methylene blue, because you could treat methyl hemoglobinuria with this. This blocks that same mechanism. You could probably, if this was true, you could probably treat it by eating an Impossible Burger, because Impossible Burgers are made out of vegetable heme. And so that would act potentially as some kind of a donor to this. But the difficulty with it is that it just doesn't sustain itself on enough of a physical level. So we're still left with one dilemma, which is, these people have low levels. Their oxygen saturations are low. Why is that the case? Well, it's still there. We still don't really know. But it's surprising when you think about the fact that when your oxygen saturation goes, percentage-wise down into the low 90s, your organs start dying. So there isn't a lot of wiggle room, and you see this with the consequences of emphysema, pulmonary fibrosis, lung cancer, is that sometimes the end stage consequences actually are related not only to the primary disease, but the fact that the oxygen concentration is dropping down, and the tissues now are starting to go into a hypoxia death cycle, and that then basically results in septicemia and septic shock, and then that produces the other consequences that typically you see in the last stages. So it's a good idea to think about why this is occurring. I mean, I don't think there's any necessity to put it on the other theory that I just discussed with you, because we do know that people who are in the real severe stages of COVID and have pneumonia, their expectoration is characteristically sort of bright, hot pink. So there's a lot of hemolysis that's going on at the alveolar interface. And that's probably more likely to play an important role in the consequences. And then, you know, we could ask ourselves $1 million question is really, have we been rushing with the ventilators, perhaps maybe a little too precipitously? And some studies are showing that you do better if you hold off till the absolute last minute before you actually intubate somebody, because you can even, you know, use high pressure oxygen up to 10%, and, you know, under pressure, and it seems to work reasonably well and tends to mitigate having to go to the next step. And, you know, I've never witnessed a person who was basically put on a ventilator, but people don't like it. So, you know, typically you can range from getting a mild anxiolytic to allay your anxiety to having to be put into a drug-induced coma because you just refuse to have this thing hanging in your lungs. So it's not for nothing that, you know, what is the chances of once a person with COVID-19 goes, does anybody know the percentage of people who come off ventilators?
Not very high.
It must be extremely low.
Yeah, I don't think people do.
20%. 20. If you go on a ventilator with COVID-19, you got a 4 out of 5 chance that you're going to be taken off and dead. Okay, so you have you would think, okay, so, you know, how do you look at this equation? I mean, obviously, if they just can't breathe anymore, that's what you can do. But you know, going back to what I was saying before, if we had opportunities to address the aspects of the infection that could be modifiable. Now, this gets you into another area of tremendous unknowns, and that's, you know, viral load and frequency of exposure. And these two things, now I see, is that Jesse? He's got like 4 cats over there. So now we get to see who's the cat people and who are the dog people. It seems to be an overabundance of cat people.
You see my dog? I got 2 cats and 2 dogs.
Okay. Well, put a dog up there. I'm a dog guy.
Come here, Hart. Come here. Come here.
Oh, he's a cutie.
Yeah, he's a sweetheart.
If I could just add something about the ventilators, I mean, if it adds to the conversation, but our emergency medicine teacher on Fridays, Dr. Coley, he works at the Bronx hospital. And he said that they wait until the pulse ox saturation is about 30 before ventilating them. And every person he's seen, once they put on ventilator, they just decompensate rapidly. And that's kind of it. But imagine an oxygen saturation of like 30. And that means people who have 60 or 70, they're just holding them and watching them, and right? So,
and they will have those 60 or 70s they're going to have some long-term consequences as well, because there will be systemic and constitutional consequences from that. And it might be exaggerated fibrinolytic activity. You know, they're knowing that these lungs are they're messed up big time for most of the people who get to that stage. So, and I mean, this is, and the people I've talked to have really been quite clear that this is just something that nobody had really ever come in contact with before, had any experience.
Has everyone seen the x-rays of the lungs and the change that will happen over 72 hours, basically? Because I can like maybe post it to the group if people haven't seen it. But if you have seen it, I mean, I don't read the news, so if people have already seen this, then I won't bother. But
Yeah, you know, they're
amazing. They're like opaque, 72 hours.
They're massively opaque, and really, this pathogenesis of this particular strand of coronavirus is it's so different. This is very aberrant, even as far as respiratory viruses go. If you look at, for instance, MERS and SARS, they had an immediate infection in the upper respiratory tract, and that basically was not only, well, it was an early stage indicator. So people who were infected within a very short period of time, they looked sick, they acted sick, they were sick. This particular SARS-2 actually spends a whole lot of time in the nasal pharynx and then in the throat, and then seems to bypass the upper pulmonary areas and goes exclusively to the lower. Whereas the other respiratory viruses are almost all upper respiratory viruses. And because so much of this is occurring at the pulmonary sort of basement, you know, you're dealing with a whole lot more complications in terms of inflammasome activity and complement fixation and fibrotic changes and all sorts of things having to do with changes to viscosity, thromboembolisms. And then you get all the secondary, then you've got cardiac consequences too. So, you know, this is going to leave that middle, what you would call moderate to severe influenza stage. These people are going to have physical consequences that might be lifelong in terms of predilections for more opportunistic infections, perhaps, or low-grade or chronic bronchitis, bronchiectasis, those kind of things are probably going to be more likely. There's probably going to be a fair share of PTSD as well.
May I ask something?
Sure.
I've been kind of looking at the typical lab profile for someone admitted for COVID, and one of the things that I can't wrap my head around is why particularly we would see elevated D-dimer. Like, it doesn't seem that, I might be unfamiliar with like typical ARDS, I guess, serology, but D-dimer seems abnormal.
Well, I mean, it is part of the whole coagulation issue that has to
Yeah.
and so now here's an interesting thing that I do remember coming across. I think I lost my screen. There we go. Quercetin has some efficacy here.
Specifically with anticoagulation, or?
Yeah. So let's see if I can figure this out. You just have to bear with me here. I think it actually, you know, it's interesting. I put stuff on the Facebook group and then it just gets lost. It's not a good forum for being able to hold on to stuff really easily. But let me see if I can find it. You all been eating better because of this whole thing? I know I have. Taking time to cook. I discovered something the other day was really weird. I'll tell you about in a second. If I want to find this other thing on quercetin. It's amazing. This, I don't know if you've gone by this Facebook group, but it's interesting because it's got a lot of good stuff, and then you just have so many people who just post stuff because they're just so scared and nervous, and and it's like people really just, it's amazing. The whole information thing is kind of a double-edged sword. You get so many people who just say stuff. I mean, there's just this whole thing going on about, where the heck is this damn thing? Let's see, Control F. There we go. Now I gotta figure out how to get this thing on the screen. All right. Targeting protein disulfide isomerase with flavonoid isoquercetin. And isoquercetin and quercetin works the same way. Isoquercetin's got a bit more bioavailability than quercetin, but I thought this was very interesting, and it showed that this was effective at being able to have some beneficial effects on this protein disulfide isomerase, which is part of some of the hypocoagulability stuff. Now, I don't know necessarily what the mechanistic basis of the whole association with that is. I never really tracked it down much, but the reality is that where did my screen go? Oh, you're looking at my screen. Please assign another. Yeah, I don't want to leave the meeting. Okay. So, what's the other thing you might have come across about quercetin that makes it so fascinating in these times? You guys aware of that? No? Do you know what a zinc ionophore is?
Doesn't quercetin stop some protein of coronavirus going into cells? That's all I remember from a lecture.
Who's that, Sarah?
Yeah, that's me. Hi, sorry.
What do we got? A picture of you getting a white coat?
Sorry, hi. That was my Facebook. I'm like, hi. Wasn't that in a lecture, like grand rounds, that quercetin stops corona from going into the cell?
Yeah, no.
Off? Okay, off. I'm sorry. That's all I remember.
That
Okay,
might have been nettle root. Quercetin was mentioned in I don't remember what they said about quercetin, but I think what you're thinking of might have been the nettle root.
yeah, it could be. Nettle root has a lectin that interferes with the capacity of the virus to utilize the ACE2 receptor.
Oops. Sorry.
Okay. Well, a zinc ionophore is a compound that opens up a gate that allows the influx of zinc into the cytoplasm of a cell. And zinc is a very highly ionic molecule, so in solution it obviously has, it's supercharged with 2 extra electrons, and the tendency, because of that ionic charge, is that it will have almost impossible for it to diffuse across the cell membrane. So you're left with the fact that there's a reasonable amount of zinc in most people in their extracellular fluids and serum. But zinc is very critical, so the body has to evolve a way to basically allow the zinc to come in, but under a much more controlled manner. But it can't let zinc diffuse passively, because zinc actually will ramp up a lot of processes that the body would prefer to have much more control over. Like, for instance, there's all sorts of lysosomal activity and all sorts of things. So you just can't let the zinc penetrate. So what happens is the body has ionophoric gates, and chemicals that are known as ionophores open up those gates, and it allows zinc to actually pass into the cell. And it turns out that actually RNA viruses are very sensitive to the levels of zinc, and the initial stages of coronavirus reproduction does, because it's an RNA virus, it takes place directly in the cytosol. So the modulation of a small amount of extra zinc into the cytoplasm has been shown to have very, very distinct effects on virtually stopping viral reproduction. Now, the most common zinc ionophores, believe it or not, fall into the same framework as the chloroquines and hydroxychloroquines and stuff. However, the natural product that's been best studied is quercetin, which is a naturally and well-researched zinc ionophore. So the other side of the coin with aspects of what we advocate people do as far as a sort of more of a proactive preventive approach does involve quercetin. And so we wind up with a twofold benefit. A similarity here in terms of the quinine analogs, in terms of its effects on causing a zinc influx. Now, the other side of the coin is, if you look at what's the other aspect that has to do with the quinine analogs, is that they have effects on endosomal pH. That's the single classic sine qua non. The virus has to make endosomal fusion, little globules that have to be where the final stages of protein synthesis occur. And most of these endosomal globules are in they're endosomal, so they're usually endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus. These are the secretory processes in the cell that are involved normally with the cell production, cell secretions. And you know that when you synthesize a protein based upon an RNA template, that protein is going to assume its three-dimensional shape over time as the amino acids do their little song and dance. But typically, the protein still has to go into some endoplasmic reticulum compartment where it gets glycosylated. And that's where the protein assumes its fourth dimensional characteristics. The glycosylation is where the protein essentially gets its future capacities for binding and all the other kinetic things that occur to it. Also, too, a lot of its, the proteins have a capacity to locate based upon glycosylation characteristics. So that final glycosylation that takes place is done, and this is done in the endoplasmic reticulum, and then it's formed into a endosome, which is a kind of a blob, and then that thing migrates to the outside of the cell where it fuses and it releases the virus out into the world to do this all over again. Well, it turns out that the major implied mechanistic basis to the quinine analogs is this endosomal alkalinization that occurs. And it's known, all the quinine drugs do this. Matter of fact, it's part of their mechanistic basis of why they're effective against Plasmodium as well. So there you have two aspects, that one of them that are shared by the quinine analogs. The zinc ionophore capacity is something that is mimicked by quercetin. the other side of the coin is that Chinese skullcap has the capacity to change the endosomal pH in a manner similar to chloroquine. So if you wanted the naturopathic version of chloroquine, it would be a combination of quercetin and Chinese skullcap, because then quercetin would act as the zinc ionophore, Chinese skullcap would act as the endosomal alkalinizer. And that's kind of a naturopathic roll your own version of what you could do with these kind of things. I don't know if the information on blood type was out the last time we talked. There are 2 studies that show that there is a predilection for type A to have a more severe process associated with infection. Matter of fact, some hospitals now are putting a premium on type O's in terms of intensive care type situations. And we've done some polls with people who have gone more severe, and they do tend to have an unexpected amount of type A. But it's no surprise. I mean, virtually all infectious diseases show a predilection for one blood type or another. That's probably the reason blood types persist, is that they give this evolutionary capacity for a certain stratified population to be susceptible, but that by design means that this other population will be resistant. In other words, if you're a person who makes blood type A but makes an antibody against blood type B, that particular set of attributes might, in this particular epidemic, be a problem if the active agent is B-like, but in another pandemic, it might be a beneficial thing if the infectious agent is A-like. And so this is largely why, if you go to things like a variety of protozoal, viral, bacterial things, they always have predilections for one blood type or another. So this is not surprising. And it's been known that coronaviruses have a higher, most of your influenza strains show predilections for one blood type or another as well. So it turns out that they had this observation, but it's interesting because I think I'm the only person who ever bothered wondering why. And it turns out that actually there's a very good reason. It's the capacity to make an opposing blood group antibody to blood group A that conveys the benefit and the protection. It turns out that the anti-A antibody that's typically made by people who are type O interacts with the S protein at the point where it connects to the ACE2 receptor. This actually was demonstrated for the first SARS virus and the Middle Eastern respiratory virus. We know that there's this capacity. It also makes perfect sense if you look at some of the other things that are indicated as well that are not blood type specific. The association with what's called mannose binding lectin with regard to its ability to, there are certain polymorphisms of people who have inabilities to make certain levels of MBL2. These are very well studied. They're associated with predilections for juvenile otitis media and stuff. You all know what MBL2 is?
Mm-hmm.
Good. It's a serum opsonin, basically. It's a part of the complement innate immunity that wasn't around when I learned innate immunity. They actually only had classic complement cascade and alternate complement cascade. I'm so old that those are the 2 forms of innate immunity I learned. The whole lectin pathway hadn't even been elucidated at that point because they didn't even know that there was such a thing as a lectin that was made endogenously. All lectins were thought to be only exogenous. But it turned out that actually there's a variety of lectins that are made internally by us. And mannan-binding lectin is one of them. And the interesting thing here is that the levels of mannan-binding lectin tend to be lower in type A as well. So you have the inability to be able to synthesize a anti-A class antibody plus a general tendency to have a downregulation of this MBL2, which seems to be the thing that's kind of puts A's at a little bit of a disadvantage. But you can get around that because, I mean, like most of these things have hacks. And with this, you know, you have all the A-like lectins out there that are specific for A-like epitopes, but not specific for A itself. So you have fava beans and silver dollar mushrooms and soy. All these foods contain agglutinins that would more or less double for the missing anti-A antibodies that people who are type A can't make against this. Lectins show up again and again and again with coronavirus, mainly because viruses basically use lectins of their own making to do what they need to do. When you talk about a hemagglutinin on an influenza virus, that's a fancy word for a lectin. I mean, just another word for lectin. One of the other lectins that showed up as being very, very strongly indicated as well is the lectin from Allium porum. You know what that is? Anybody want to guess? It's leeks.
I was thinking leeks.
Leeks. And they did some real good studies and came out of with 3 studies concurring that these fall into a framework of what are known as monocot mannose binding lectins. That's the entire category. They're mannose binding lectins from monocots. Monocots are mostly your alliums and things like that. So again, here's how we can knit the story up again. What did I say before? Mannose binding lectin. What am I talking about again? Mannose monocot lectins here. The one from leek being the most powerful in terms of its abilities to interfere with coronavirus attachment through the ACE2 receptor. So these are things that would really qualify as that stage 1, which is the mild influenza. This is the kind of stuff that I would, if I had a person who I was monitoring who had this, I would be using these things because, you're dealing with low levels of viremia. These things are safe. They can be integrated very easily. Lectins are very, very profound molecules because they don't typically obey things like the law of mass action. They don't give you an effect that's totally dependent on the size of the dose. There's a phenomenon with lectins called capping. And you might be familiar with a chemical called ricin that's used to kill some spy back in the 70s. They found a little tiny gold ball in his leg that somebody stabbed him with an umbrella. And inside that gold ball, there were 2 microscopic holes drilled, and they still found traces of ricin. But the amount of that ricin that was in that particular agent that was actually the thing that was given to him was measured in microdoses. So here's a lectin that was able over the course of, I think, 48 or 72 hours to produce massive amounts of hemolysis, even though the doses were near homeopathic. And the reason for that is that lectins produce a phenomenon where as they act on the cellular receptors, they cause the receptors to migrate to, I guess you would say, like the North Pole. It's called capping. The receptors migrate and form a cap. And basically what's happening is they're all just sort of glomming onto each other. And then what happens is as that cap is formed, the covalent forces shift and reverse, and that causes the lectin to disassociate. So actually, we don't really know what would be a profoundly effective dose because it may be that reasonably insignificant doses may work well because they simply work over and over and over again. So I like leeks. I like shallots had also too. Their particular lectins were also very effective. And then finally, the last lectin there was Urtica dioica, which has Urtica dioica glutenin. Very, very interesting lectin. Interesting. I wrote a blog on it and was contacted by somebody who worked for NIH who said, assured me that NIH was extraordinarily interested in urticodiocolectin right now, and they wanted to just compare notes and things. And so we were talking a little bit about, how could we scale up the doses from, what was showing effectiveness in animals, and how do we come up with some kind of a dose for a human? And it turns out that actually you could probably get a reasonably good dose of urticodiocarglutamine with a couple of 100 to 1,000 milligrams of urticodiocarrhizome, which is taken by a lot of people because it has effects on sex hormone binding globulin. So you see a lot of middle-aged people, especially guys, get this functional medicine. People use it for that. But urticodiocarglutamine is actually a superantigen too. So it has interesting effects in terms of clonal activation of CD8 cells. And most of these CD8 cells are kind of what you're looking to have activated in coronavirus in terms of immune modulatory effects. And also, too, their spectrum of cytokines is more to the mark. It's more about being able to deal specifically with the infection rather than causing collateral damage. So we looked at that, and it turns out that urticodiocarglutamine does have effects on ACE2 attachment of the S protein. But they also identified that there were what they called early and late fusion events that were being blocked by urticodioc as well. So a lot of the components of viral fusion, where it was merging with the cell membrane and being able to migrate through there and then basically fuse out again, were interfered with urticodioc as well. Where else do we need to go with this? Some of the other ones that basically we looked at as well from a study, analytical standpoint, was modulating inflammasome activity, and for that we looked at the best indicated there was melatonin. We worked that one backwards and forwards, and that turned out to be very interesting because even under the circumstances of what was involved, and I don't know how familiar you are with inflammasomes and that whole mechanism, but they're a tripwire innate immunity thing that's often activated by what are called PAMPs. These are pattern recognition molecules that typically look for certain antigenic patterns that would indicate, from a simple yes-no perspective, that there was infection with a variety of recognized microbial patterns. And so these PAMPs, PAMPF, pattern recognition things, they're like tripwires, and they sort of interact with a variety of CD markers. CD14 is maybe the big one. And they have a direct relationship with toll-like factor 2, toll-like factor 4. So there's a whole, if you go into Opus, there's a real good molecular map on inflammasomes, and it's all clickable. The big guy there is one called NLRP3. That's the major inflammasome marker, and that's the one that seems to show the most promise with regard to melatonin. In the beginning, I talked about vitamin D and vitamin C, and there was some flurry because 2 functional medicine people had come down on the side of recommending against vitamin D. And this was interesting because, and this is how you get into trouble. It's like you go into the Lego set of your mind, you find some studies that show that such and such thing has increased a biomarker, and then you extrapolate out that because of that observation, it's probably bad under these circumstances because these are very biomarkers we want to be careful about having because they could be predilection, they can be involved in the production of the advanced inflammatory fiascos. But here's the problem: you have a study that is done on a cell culture, and they drop a dumpster full of this stuff on the cells after first priming the cells to produce the effect that they want. So let's twiddle the cell and then drop a busload of this crap on top of it and see what happens. And that's how you wind up with those kind of conclusions. Here's the other side of the coin, and this is the part that gets me. We have studies that show in the specific scenario the utility of the substance. And still people would say, well, because I can conceive of this thing, I'm having a problem, and I think people shouldn't use it. And yet here's another study that says, well, one of the clear signs of progression to ARDS is vitamin D deficiency. So how does your Lego assumption compare to somebody who's made an absolute hardcore observation about the nature of this with regard to a disease? So you have a whole thing with that. There's other studies that show that vitamin D actually vitamin D deficiency being associated with an increased risk of cytokine storm. So here's two hard studies looking directly at a causal basis that clearly indicate that the amount of vitamin D that basically people should get is going to be very safe, largely not going to play into any kind of a consequential event as far as cytokines. And think about it. I mean, who's got vitamin D out there right now? Everybody uses sunblock. Everybody wears, clothing all over the place. There's not a whole lot of sun. Everybody takes 3 showers a day, so you don't even have the oils on your skin that can convert it to vitamin D. So what's the big issue here with being able to get people's vitamin D levels up to around 50 or even 60? Nothing at all. Which takes us to the other thing, which is the elderberry controversy. And here's another thing too. Somebody found an article that showed that elderberry increased cytokines. And this was now a terrible thing. Don't take elderberry. And yet we have the same exact juxtaposition. Here's somebody playing with Legos in their mind based upon biomarker studies of in vitro analysis, yet here are studies that show, well, elderberry effective in upper respiratory, elderberry effective in coronavirus. So how do you compare these two things? These are absolute causal events. These are hypotheticals. And the interesting thing is if you go look at the studies that are involved in determining how these cytokines are made, they're the most insignificant. Even the studies that show that they increase cytokines, they do this to an insignificant degree. Mathematically, if you ran a half marathon, you would have 100 times the level of cytokines that elderberry could produce. So you want to give people some useful advice as they're going into ICU to get ventilated? Tell them that they shouldn't run any marathons for the near future, because that's going to raise their cytokines a whole lot more than elderberry is. So what are we left with? I was reading something very interesting today, which was there's some conflicting information on even things like, we like to think that cigarette smoke was going to mess you up when it came to basically having upper respiratory tract infections. And yet there's some evidence that suggests that in certain instances, the number of smokers was a little bit less than was expected. Now that could be artifactual or whatever, but it turns out that there's studies that show that nicotine actually depresses the number of ACE2 receptor expression. And so it might not necessarily be that the smoking was protected as much as the amount of nicotine they were getting. And the other thing you can think of, and I don't know if you know this from your botanical medicine thing, but this got me thinking of lobelia. Because ultimately lobelia has what? Globally, which is what? Indian tobacco, which is what? The optical isomer of nicotine. So it's the other sided hand of the nicotine molecule. So I thought to myself, first I did is I asked a few friends if they were using it at all. A few said that they were. But I was thinking that that's something else I'd look into if I had a person who was really starting to strike me as going into a more progressive type of situation as well. So where am I at here? Okay, there's one final thing I wanted to talk about too, which is sulforaphanes, right? Which are, your sprouted veggies and things. There's a article, and it's on this blog I wrote, and it's kind of like why older people seem to be most impacted. And the thing that caught my attention was, are you seeing this over here? The thing that caught my attention was this TMPRSS2, which is a family of ligands that massively increase the connectivity of SARS to the ACE2 receptor. And this is normally produced as a result of ROS activity. And so the literature, what we were able to find was that actually it turns out that the normal control mechanism for this, when this gets upregulated, the ACE2 receptor avidity increases dramatically. When this is in need of being controlled, it activates what are called the antioxidant response elements, which are the NRF2 and KEAP1. These are the superoxide dismutase 1, superoxide dismutase 2. These are the antioxidant genesis, endogenous antioxidant production machinery. And so these get you your things like your superoxide dismutase, your catalase, and stuff like that. And this is how the body tamps down this TMPRSS2. Well, it turns out the literature has all sorts of information, but one of the things that came out strongest was basically that sulforaphane was very, very powerful at being able to brought this down. But it also made me think, these are the exact things that drop in an age-related manner. Antioxidant levels drop precipitously as we get older. So I was looking at, well, maybe these are other things that I would be putting into my early stage things that would be useful, more sprouted things, cruciferous vegetables. And it turns out that there's a SNP on this particular gene that does have some strength behind it as a predictive advice for some of the severity of COVID-19. So, there's a strong causal relationship that can be demonstrated with this particular protein, and it's interesting. I don't know if you've read any of these blog entries. I can send the links to you. But the other one that I was looking at here was interesting, was this pyrotosis. And what I liked about this pyrotosis is, well, about apoptosis, right? Well, this is the inflammatory consequences that come from inflammasome activation. They induce pyrotosis. And it was interesting because there was a researcher in Japan who I was in contact with who was drawing a strong correlation to lactate hydrogenase, LDH levels, and using those as an implication of the propensity of the person to go into pyrotosis would be a placeholder for ARDS. So, and this is one of the things that's considered to be a marker associated with COVID. The other one that's coming up now is reflective of some later findings that have just come out that are talking about the fact that they're finding lymphocytes that are undergoing damage and destruction as a result of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And they're liking that to, kind of an AIDS phenomenon. But unlike AIDS, where the retrovirus actually used the T helper cells to produce new viruses, there's a clear sign that if there is viral lymphocytic destruction going on as a consequence of COVID-2, it's not because the lymphocytes are being used to manufacture virus particles or anything. That doesn't seem to be. It may be related to destruction of the lymphocyte as a result of some of these other inflammatory activities. There's also some changes to TP53 that we notice, and when TP53 gets brought into the question, there's a diminishment in apoptosis resistance, and so it may be that these lymphocytes are just dying simply of exhaustion, and the infection process is secondary. But lymphopenia is one. You're probably aware of this. Is one of the consequences, one of the concomitants of this infection. So, but one of the good things is that it doesn't appear that the virus doesn't like seek out lymphocytes. It's not going to be like an AIDS version of this. Other things to keep in mind, there were some interesting studies that I was reading today that seemed to indicate that a viral vaccine may be rather simple and not difficult to achieve. They were, at least in animal studies, they were using relatively straightforward viral vaccines, and didn't require any adjuvants or anything, and they were getting a considerable amount of response. So we may wind up with a vaccine. We're probably going to wind up with several, but they may have if we're lucky, and this article points anywhere towards what the future will be, is that these vaccines might be more comparison to other vaccines. They're going to not have a whole lot of moving parts, and they do seem to be somewhat efficacious. The other thing that came out in the last 2 days that I thought was interesting was that we might be able to put a nail in the coffin that reinfection occurs. So that's good news, because you worry that, oh my God, here are these people saying that somebody has been caused to have been reinfected. But let me see if I can find that study. No, that's what I'm looking at. All right, so what did I just do? Let's see if I can move you all over here someplace. So what they looked at, and this was published in Nature. This is not one of those Chinese preprints. This actually just came out in Nature, I think, today, and they looked at the cases that had been able to retrieve samples. So the dotted line is the detection limit, and you can see over time that the various, this is a throat swab, this is sputum, this is stool, that they do pop around in and out here, and some of that clearly indicates that these were recovery issues. And in essence, basically, it looks that once you get past a certain period of time, and it might be 4 weeks or so, or whatever, at that point, you can't recover anything from anybody. So good news, because that implies that 4 to 6 weeks after infection, it appears that at that point the person doesn't even harbor any viruses, let alone being contagious at that point. It does indicate that maybe we're being a little too optimistic with looking in quarantine time frames of 14 days or so, and probably the the most conservative and most accurate would be a quarantine period of 28 to 35 days. That would give you maximum coverage. By the time that person emerged from quarantine, you can send them into the ICU at that point. I mean, they're carrying antibodies and they're definitely not infectious. So this is a good piece of news, because there was just very, very unsettling things coming out with regard to this. It was starting to look a whole lot like, the common cold, where you simply got a cold and then 3 weeks later you got it again. And of course, that's not going to be so great with a disorder like this. So this was a great piece of news. Other things, now you start looking at the whole public health thing, and then you start going to yourself, okay, now how are we going to get ourselves out of this mess? The answer to that is, I don't think anybody really knows. Some of the forecasting now is, it looks like 2022 before everything gets back to 100% normal. And even then, I mean, if you look at anything came out of any of the other pandemics, that's about right. Now, that might not necessarily mean that all of us are going to be doing this in 2022, but, nobody's talking about being able to have large events. I think most people would say that, at least for the better part of the rest of this year, they're not going to allow events that have greater than 50 people. So forget about your NBA games and your rock concerts and things like that. So then the other thing, I mean, is ultimately is, when do you get back to airline travel? And a lot of this is going to be predicated on top of everything else by consumer confidence. How are people going to feel comfortable about getting on an airplane? And, rushing things, making, you have politicians who want to get things opened up, but you can see there's reports coming out of Japan now and South Korea that show that the worst thing you can do is actually be too aggressive in being able to force back to open society. And Japan now has just really experienced essentially a phase 2. So we don't really have a good answer as to when essentially, it's going to be safe to run around and go to rock concerts and do all sorts of stuff like that. But we'll have phased openings, and certainly we'll have more of a reality, but especially in the groups that are high risk, they may be practicing types of isolation not terribly dissimilar than what's going on now for the better part of the next year. Although you might have situations where, they have people where you expand out. So they're saying, it's not going to be this type of isolation. It might be you and your immediate family after everybody gets themselves all cleared out and stuff. So in other words, you're going to have a more socially satisfying life, but not necessarily the ability to flow through society like we had in the past, at least for not another year and a half or so. But you might be, you should be able to have families should be able to reconnect, and small businesses should be functional to a certain degree. So, and of course, the bottom is going to be what's going to happen, with regard to the percentage of people who are now unemployed. How many of them will come back to work? How many of those people will be able to support themselves, given the fact that many people are marginal in terms of their finances to start? So there's a lot of issues that are going to have to be looked at with regard to endgame here,
Wait, hold on. But why is this one going to be this way? Because like SARS, for example, it wrapped up in a couple months, and then, that was kind of it. So why is this one different?
Well,
Like it had
SARS had tiny clusters in Toronto and a few other places.
But like I was in China at the time, and it never came back in China. Like we were okay, like.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're looking at something that had, Okay. Well, look at Ebola. I mean, normally, they put a wall around these things. They bring in the guys in the astronaut suits, and then they quarantine everybody, and they get it down to where they've got they have a hot zone, and then they kind of put that thing out. And they've done this for MERS. They did this for SARS-1. They've done it for Ebola. They did it for H1N1. To a certain degree, that's just good public health. It's just good epidemiology. Where the problem with this is this thing got to a point where the genie was out of the bottle. You have an entire different characteristic at that point. When you have this degree of penetration, and let's assume, I've seen various numbers, but the one I like the best is 15% of the American public has probably been exposed to this virus. So at any given amount, you have obviously asymptomatic carriers, you have people who go on and get mild infections, and then you have the people who wind up in the frozen morgue. And if it was only as simple as being able to let everybody go through the whole flu thing, then it'd be great, because we'd do the whole herd immunity thing, get to it 80%, and then that would be the end of it. This thing would burn itself out. But the problem is that you've got a fatality rate that seems a lot higher than people were saying, and depending, and you don't really know, because we don't know the total number of who's dying from this at this point. But even New York State has a fatality rate that's over 5%. So that's a very high amount of dead people for a disease.
But is part of that because of the way they count it? Like if someone dies of something and they had COVID, they say they died of COVID. Like even if it's not necessarily the cause of death.
Well, it would have been the cause of death if they hadn't died, if they hadn't gotten COVID. Right. In other words, you take a person who has a heart condition, okay, and ask yourself, if that person with the heart condition would still be here if he didn't catch COVID-19, then actually the cause of death was COVID-19, because ultimately without COVID-19, the person would still be here. Now, you can say to yourself that that's obviously a whole different story than just some poor slob walking down the street, minding his old business, who gets COVID-19 and dies exclusively of COVID-19. That's just another COVID-19 death too. But it's very hard to tease out comorbidities because these are complicated interlocking things, and the end result is it's almost like a numbers game. Did that person not die of COVID? Well, the only way you can answer that question is to take COVID out of the equation and ask yourself, would they still be here? And the answer most of the time is yes. If that person was going to die of that heart condition anyway, then it's wrong to blame COVID. But what are the odds that they would have died that same day that they got COVID, such that we can't blame COVID for it? I would say that the reality is that it's a grim reaper. It's an angel of death for elderly people. And we can say, well, yeah, they've got all their comorbidities and everything, but if the fact was that without this particular pandemic, they'd still be here, then the pandemic was, in fact, caused their death. I think there's a lot of questions about how people are looking at things like that, because somebody has brought up that hospitals get paid more if they dial it in as a COVID or something like that. I don't know. It's interesting. I find, so much of what I try to do with a lot of the people that are in this group I manage is to just get them to just think better, and I'm not saying that you're not thinking well. You're a great thinker, but I think we try to, we don't look at Occam's razor sometimes and say to ourselves, we already have a simple explanation, so there's no further need to make a more complicated explanation. It's one of the few scientific things I wholeheartedly ascribe to, that keep it simple, stupid. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, it's hard to say that we will know ever if this was a Chinese invention in some lab, or whether it was a bioterrorism weapon, or Bill Gates designed this thing, or 5G makes it worse. That's for historians to figure out. It's for historians to figure out. And there will be, because you have investigative journalists and stuff. But here's my theory, is that, and this is my theory about virtually any conspiracy type theory that people tell me, unless it's based in what I can seem to be some objective facts. Conspiracy theories require people to be really, really smart. When you look at like conspiracy theories in the movies, the villains are always arch villains, and they're always like really high IQ people, because let's face it, coming up with a conspiracy to take over the world, you have to be pretty smart. Now, contrast that with the more likely explanation that all of this is the result of people who are assholes. Okay? They're dumb fucks. They're idiots. They're ignorant. They're small-minded. They don't see beyond their nose. What do you think is the greater odds? The greater odds is that these are the results of human failings that are just a fact of life. That basically you have, you saw, maybe you saw the movie Chernobyl, series Chernobyl, and you realize that in a communist state, people don't like to tell their bosses bad news. So they don't, and then this thing festers. And then, you think to yourself, okay, these Chinese people are running down the street in astronaut suits, and they're spraying the streets and doing all sorts of things. And they just went for their Chinese New Year. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that ain't good. Okay. Because let's face it, this is an open society. And then you ask any Japanese or any Chinese person, what's the country they want to go visit? Italy. They all want to go see the Colosseum. They all want to go see Michelangelo's David. All Asians are frustrated Italian people. So in essence, it's a classic thing. It just, they had a huge influx of tourism in that area, bada boom, and then open societies. And here we are. So, you look at other containment efforts, now here's the weird part. I wrote another thing on this as well. The whole lack of preparation that characterized how this country responded to this, the idea that if you just ignore it, it'll go away, the idea that, this is not going to show up here, the idea that the risk to the American public is low, that we have adequate amounts of protective devices, that our emergency rooms are adequately staffed, that we have enough capacity, all of that under preparation will be exceeded by the huge amount of over preparation that will follow. So like I said, and jokingly in one of my blogs, I think by Thanksgiving, we'll have 100 million ventilators, and by New Year's Eve, we'll have 1 billion ventilators. Okay? Because that's unfortunately the way we get things done in this country. We underreact and overcompensate. So, you don't really know what the long-term solution is. We might have situations where my call on this is that we'd be in a position probably by mid-July. You guys would probably be in some version of a clinical environment back again, where there's some patient contact and direct activity, probably by end of July or August. And then going into the fall, things will ramp up a little bit more as well. But other people might be much more isolated, and you might be doing a whole lot more telemedicine type stuff. I don't even know if your clinic is equipped to do that. But I don't think it is, because you have the world's worst EMR system, if I remember correctly. But there's lots of things that we don't know yet. But what I try to do here in this time is kind of give you what I know at this point. And a lot of it is up in the air, but we will see. But I believe that we as a profession should have embraced our role in the early stage management, for which our allopathic brothers and sisters have assumed no responsibility for whatsoever. So we should be thinking about being able to provide the anticipatory services, the genetic analysis that identifies certain risk groups, the foods in the early stages that might convey protective or preventive effects. Having done that, should a person go into a stage where they've become in contact and they're infected and they're going to go through the influenza stage, we should have a set of protocols and decision trees in place so that we can guide them through that process so that they go through that with the minimum amount of discomfort. They go through it to be able to engender an optimum immune response, a very discrete immune response, to control for side effects, to mitigate against the other consequences, and to prevent utilization of precious health resources and keep those people out of hospitals and ICUs. As part of keeping them healthy is just keeping them out of hospitals as well. And I think we have to think about adopting that from a public awareness standpoint. As I said at the very beginning, in China, they don't have a problem doing a study that combines 2 allopathic antivirals and 3 TCM herbs. And yet we have no presence in this dialogue here, no presence in this narrative. So we're going to have to start doing stuff about that. And I suspect that you want to have, this is an opportunity to serve humankind here. And, we have things here that can seriously make a difference in terms of the overall health of the people and the population. And you think about it, I mean, I don't know what our reach is in terms of underserved populations, but, we talk about how minorities and people of color are getting screwed by this. Shouldn't we have channels of communication to those people that are giving them the kind of information that we have that they can use proactively so that, again, they avoid the consequences of being underserved by the allopathic healthcare system, it's a good idea to keep them out of that if we can. So, you should be thinking about this kind of stuff as well. Because, I suspect that by the time we're done with this, until we forget how to do it, for the next couple of 10 or 15 years, I think, we're going to get so burned by this that you won't be able to sneeze in Grand Central Station before somebody hoses you down with something. So, the reality is that who knows what the future will be, but, some of you guys know I read a lot of history. And if you look at the consequences of the Black Death in 1349, 48, 47, and of course that killed a lot of people. So you're looking at 35% of the population died. Your population was diminished by 33%, millions of people. But it caused an upheaval because the society was so destabilized that for the first time, people could ask for wages and ask to get paid. Up until that point, everything was all feudal. In other words, I have my plot of land, I grow some stuff, I give you half. But all of a sudden, because so many people were dead, there was such a labor shortage that people couldn't negotiate for the first time, and we had the beginning of to be able to have a wage-based economy. And you think to yourself that these types of pandemics really do produce an aftermath where things certainly don't go back to the way they were before. We're going to have a discussion about healthcare because we don't have a healthcare system. Okay, what's our role going to be in that? I don't know. But we should be thinking about that, and we should be thinking about the kind of role that we're going to play. What that will be, it's hard to say. I do know, in the course of my life, who's sneezing over there? Did you put your hand on your thing there? In the course of my 30 some odd years, I've saved the healthcare system a lot of money. I had at least 2 people who were headed for liver transplants and never got them. How much does a liver transplant cost the healthcare system? Hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would have been nice if they gave me 1% of that. I would have been happy. But of course, nobody gave me, let alone 1%, nobody gave me any credit. But it was a fact. These people were headed for those transplants and they didn't get them. So we know we can save this healthcare system money. But we don't seem to have that kind of capacity. Your generation of naturopaths is going to have to, you're going to just have to do it better than we did. You just have to be able to stare people down, try to denigrate, belittle you, and push back. And you're going to have to know your value, and you're going to have to be able to express it. And sometimes I see how we explain ourselves, and where there's just a confused state about, we don't even know how we fill needs, let alone how can we expect someone else to figure out how we fill needs. It just doesn't happen. So, we did the best we could. My generation did the best we could. We got it to this point, for better or worse. You guys are going to have to take it the next step. You're going to have to move the goalpost a little further, and hopefully that's going to be bringing this kind of information to people in a way that is clearly shows that we are responsible for the consequences of what we say. And I go back to what I said in my Facebook group. I spend most of my time talking people off the ledge, because they got all these crazy ideas about things. Who wants to, drink 3 quarts of colloidal silver, and then they tell, well, I'm drinking lots of tonic water. And it's like, the law says you can't have more than 83 milligrams of tonic water in a liter of tonic water. You can't have more than 83 milligrams of quinine. So if you look at the standard dose being about 600 to 800 milligrams, you have to drink 10 liters of quinine water a day to get a roughly half dose of the therapeutic level of quinine, which we don't even know is sufficient. And just think of all the gin you would have to use to do that. So, the reality is that people are confused. They're confused and they're scared. And when they're confused and they're scared, like that Chinese proverb, drowning man grasps at straws. They grasp. And the problem is there's a lot of people out there who play to their fears, and it's just so sad. It's like even the whole thing with vitamin D. It's like, if you have no proof that it's bad, but you have a hypothetical model, why don't you just keep your mouth shut? When I was in Catholic school in the 3rd grade, the nuns used to say, if you had nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. And it's like, what? I can tolerate a sin of omission, but a sin of misdirection. If you go to somebody and they say, which way is Westchester County? And the answer is turn right, but you tell people to turn left. That's worse than telling them you don't know when you can't help them. All right, because you actually gave them the wrong information. You sent them the wrong place. And how much of that stuff's flying around? All these functional medicine guys, they're just saying the craziest stuff. So.
Questions. One, what do you think of like a potential vaccine? I'll ask all of them. You can answer what you feel like answering. What do you think of like the potential vaccine? Because people are going to be jumping all over that. 2, what have you been looking at? Like, because moving forward, we might have patients who have had COVID and then they have lung fibrosis. And I was trying to think through like what could be helpful there. And I wasn't sure because I really haven't looked into it too much. I wasn't sure if the pathophysiology would be the same as like fibrosis in connective tissue because, it's not really
lung fibrosis.
I don't think.
Lung fibrosis is also kind of a death sentence over time, especially if you put it in the realm of pulmonary hypertension or some of the other consequences. Now, there might be very severe cases of pulmonary fibrosis in people who had severe COVID, and maybe mild cases of people who just simply had, bad pneumonia but got over it. Getting reversal of scarification, it's hard to say, because you're looking not only at the various membranous type aspects, but you're dealing with gas transfer as well. And so you've got, all the surfactants and, how do you induce alveolar regeneration? Hard to say. There's some things that I came across over time for those things. Believe it or not, I think at that point, you know, the best we could do until we get some better ideas of the indications for agents from a therapeutic standpoint is supportive care. So you would be looking at things like expector. In other words, it would be a treatment not terribly dissimilar than for CPLD, a very similar type treatment. You have another question?
So AANP has been really active. They've been sending out daily emails about, you know, they're having webinars about how to get people launched with telemedicine, how to get people, I feel like the focus has been really financial, how to save your business basically from going under during this time, how to apply for grant money, how to apply for the rescue money.
Yeah.
The telemedicine stuff I thought was helpful. So, you know, based on what you were saying here, I think this is an opportunity, right? You never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Who said that? So I don't know who said it actually, but so
Well, crisis, right? Isn't crisis an opportunity the same character in Chinese?
Yes, it is actually. Yeah. So there is an opportunity here for us to have maybe increase sort of our role in the health model, but yeah, I don't really see it happening yet, and I'm not quite sure how we would even.
I was asked to be on an AAMP special COVID-19 committee, and I agreed. And within 5 or 6 emails, it became quite clear that everything was being framed in terms of politics. And I just felt that everything should start from the perspective of how can we help humanity? Because ultimately, isn't that the best politics? You know, to go straight to the heart of the matter, which is how can we help? Where do we help? Who do we help? But they were looking at it like, you know, we need to get our foot in the door, you know, with vitamin C IV and all sorts of things. And I showed them some of the stuff I was doing, and I don't know, I felt like it wasn't going anywhere. So, you know, I still get the emails, but I don't really say anything or whatever. It's, you know, it's a political organization, so I suppose its major goal is politics. They do have a vested interest in their members surviving this thing economically, so that's good. But, you know, I didn't become a naturopath to advance naturopathic medicine. It was for me, it was a ways to a means. You know, I learned a bunch of things so I can go out and help people. Then I thought, you know, that would be probably the best way to advance naturopathic medicine is make a whole lot of happy people. And, you know, it seems like that's almost too simplistic, I think, nowadays, but that's still the way I feel. So, you know, I mean, I do participate, but I don't know. I think we are struggling to, like I said this before, you know, you have to look at what your goal is. If our goal is to get other people to like us and coexist so that we can be left to do what we want to do unopposed and unbothered, that's a terrible goal. It's a very short-sighted goal. You know, if our goal is to deconstruct and reconstruct the healthcare system, then you're talking about a very, very big obligation, but you might as well embrace it if that's indeed what you want to, what your plans are. You can't run away from that. You know, we pose an existential challenge to the dominant medical model, but we would like to act that somehow or another, if we did all the right things, they would like us. And they're not going to like us because we would be forcing an uncomfortable amount of change on their part. And we would be upsetting an uncomfortable amount of the basis of their economics. So they're only going to come to an agreement with what the role of naturopathic healthcare can be in a future healthcare system if we hit them over the head with it to the point that they're unconscious and they get the fact that if they continue to be bothersome about it, they're just going to get another hit. And then we take the public with us because our fundamental goal is to create a reform movement by appealing to the need for people to take care of themselves and take responsibility for their own lives. You carry the world on your shoulders with you. And then you don't have to show up in a state capitol and hat in hand and ask for somebody to give you something. But then again, I'm just an old hippie, so, this is my problem. Anybody got another questions or comments or anything? Or did we just, I don't know. I thought hopefully this was more kind of low-key and freewheeling, but Anthony, ask me a question.
Okay, let's see. When do you think antibody tests will be available, and will that have any impact on the situation?
Great question. They're available right now. You can get them. There's a variety of now private sector companies that are doing it. I believe you can even get a request.
There's also a study, and they're looking for 10,000 people. I could send you the link to get tested for antibodies. I actually just emailed them yesterday asking to participate because I would love to know if I have it, since I live in Westchester, where it's like the epicenter of corona.
Sure. Now, the problem with the antibody tests, as I've seen, is they're just reporting positive and negatives on the particular antibodies. So, for instance, they'll say, S protein IgM, S protein IgG, positive, negative. Me, I'm an immunologist. I want to see titers. I want to see numbers, 1 to 256. I want to see 1 to, because if you can get titer data, you can basically create the curves that are going to tell you, what kind of protection you have over the long term. But right now, I think they're just doing simple antibody isolation, and that was helping. Now, you got to keep in mind a couple of things. Some of these tests have a degree of accuracy that's around 95%. Some tests, basically, in combination with PCR, can get that up to well over 99%. But a test with an accuracy of 95%, if you know anything about Bayesian analysis and Bayesian logic, a 95% accuracy is not good enough to go out and assume that that person is been exposed and can't get you infected, because the predictive capacity at 95%, one person explained that it's pretty much a killing yourself if you actually act on that as a protective device at that level of accuracy. So, what it would be helpful for is, yes, like what Sarah said, you might be able to say, hey, I got this thing already. But we don't know if the test will basically have false positives. We don't even know. See, now, what happens if, even worse, the test has 95% accuracy, but the errors tend to run towards false positives? Now you got somebody who's outside thinking that they are safe, but they still could be infected. So they could be outside thinking that they're safe, and they could be carrying the virus, infecting their grandparents. So it's not perfect, but we'll get there. Jesse, give me a question.
I saw something online where they were talking about different vaccines, like when they had tried for SARS, that actually, if it was probably an animal had the vaccine and then was exposed to the virus, it had like an even worse response.
Yeah, that was noticed for dengue fever too. That actually, is it dengue? I forget, dengue or something like that. D-E-N-G-U.
Okay.
Dengue, which is stuff you put on your shoulder when it hurts. But
That's dengue.
dengue, yeah. Yeah, this is what I was talking about before. Do you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. The reality is, yes, you can have certain types of viruses and certain types of vaccines that an effective vaccine actually in a small number of people will actually be injurious. But at least if this article is any indication of some possibilities, is that actually when you have a vaccine that's comprised solely of a receptor binding domain, without the need for any sort of antibody-independent enhancement, that's a very, very stripped down vaccine, because there's almost nothing in it besides the very thing you're making the vaccine from. And this article, like I say, it was in mice, but it showed that you could achieve a potentially neutralizing antibody response with really a very, very stripped down vaccine. And, you know, will this basically give you that similar type of thing that we noticed with Bengay? I don't know, but it is a possibility. And as I said before, you're not going to have one vaccine probably by the time they're done. Just like you're going to have 1 billion ventilators by New Year's, you're going to probably have 35 vaccines. And you know, some will work by virtue of this, and some will work by virtue of that. Then perhaps maybe there'll be some genetic identifiers which tend to suggest one format of a vaccine versus another. But if this is true, this actually is a very good piece of news, because this is saying that you know, you don't have to, you can make something like this. It wouldn't be terribly much more complicated than a seasonal influenza vaccine. And you know, really, what is it all about? You know, it's actually, you know, who are going to get this? A geezer is going to get this. Your grandparents are going to get this. Your mothers and fathers are going to get this, because and who knows, it may be that by that time we'll be able to determine that a considerable number of your grandparents got exposed and went through it. So we'll know the people who don't have the antibodies. Then we cross-reference that with you know, comorbidities and other things, and we generate an indication that says, you know, this is the preferred way to protect yourself through this kind of a type of thing. You know, it's hard to say, but there'll be, you know, the nature of this type of society that we live in is, like I say, it's under respond and overcompensate. So there'll be all sorts of therapeutic things flying around, because there's a lot of money in this at this point. You know, there's a lot of money in this. So you can look at this as maybe being a good thing. But yeah, you're right. There are some evidence in the past with certain vaccines that actually did not necessarily in small numbers of people with the very disease, it actually amplified the disease, which is interesting. But
my concern would be that, you know, given the severity, how everything is shut down, they're going, you know, the government's going to use this to force more vaccine policies, and particularly force this one, you know, something for this, like you said, there might be 35 vaccines, and I don't know that they'll have adequate testing before they start forcing people to get them, and that would be a concern that I have.
well, it's paradoxical, because, you know, you certainly would be well within the realm of logic to worry whether or not, you know, they were rushing something to market. But then on the other hand, you have people clamoring for a vaccine in 2 months, and the government say, no, we can't make a vaccine that fast. It's got to go through a series of studies. So it's kind of like blowing out both sides of a trumpet. You have the public clamoring for something that can't be made as fast as they think it can, and other people who would be concerned that even in the right framework and the right time frame, it still would not have had a whole lot of evidence behind it in terms of long-term effects. But again, you know, what little I know about vaccines is that the simpler you make it, the more specific to the antigenic structure it resembles, the less adjuvants that you require. And in this case, they were doing it. See that thing where it says without antibody-dependent enhancement? That's a big deal, because almost all vaccines have conditions where they have to require antibody enhancement. Mm-hmm. It could be the form of aluminums or other things, Freud's adjuvants, and all sorts of stuff. This article is saying that at least in animals, they were getting neutralizing levels of antibodies with just this pure antigen of the receptor binding domain, which is the S protein. So, you know, ultimately, will we be faced with having to make a choice, and will this convert into a strong case for ramming vaccine policy down people's throats? Well, this wasn't the greatest thing for the anti-vaccine movement, I'll give you that. But the reality is this. I mean, I've never felt that vaccines per se were bad. I mean, I just think certain vaccines might be not so great. Smallpox vaccine was certainly pretty good. There's other things that I like. I mean, this is the thing I really do feel we have to work on as scientists, is to hold two completely divergent ideas in your head at the same time. That yes, you should be dubious of vaccines, but you should be able to be open to the fact that under certain circumstances, there are ones that basically may have specific value, but that still shouldn't stop you from casting a jaundiced eye towards things. I mean, we have a crazy, hypercharged political world right now, and I found some people in the anti-vax movement, they just can't find a single nice thing to say about a single vaccine. And to me, that's just too extreme. I don't like being that extreme about anything. I like to think that each thing can be evaluated on its own merit.
I agree. I don't want to paint myself as this
So we're not going to brand you the class anti-vaxxer?
No, we have somebody else for that. But
okay, good.
But I do think that we should have choice, and I am completely against mandates. And so and if you have, like, in a case like this where you have probably 70-80% of the population clamoring to get a vaccine because they're so scared of this, then that's probably going to be protective enough anyway for people.
Well, I don't even think it'll get that far, Jess. You're really looking at a herd immunity for everybody under 50. And Grandpa Joe and Grandma Eileen getting something like this. So, the reality is it's a bizarre virus. But if you're 45 or so, at worst, you get a bad case of the flu, really bad myalgia, probably some breathing difficulties, hell of a fever, and you're messed up. And then 3 months later, it's just a distant memory. Those people are not going to need vaccination. But there might be people, for instance, like your asthmatic uncle or your COPD grandmother, who may not come out of isolation until they get something like this. And that's a whole different story, and it's a whole different population away from the standard recipients of vaccine policy, which of course are children. So, will this fuel that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know does influenza vaccine fuel the childhood vaccine controversy much? Because I see this as more in alignment with kind of an influenza vaccine kind of take on things than a childhood vaccine kind of take on things. And yeah, I go to Walmart and the lady asks me if I want the flu shot, and I say no, and she says, "Oh, you really ought to get it." And I say, "Well, thank you, but I don't really want the flu shot." "Oh, you should really get it." And it's like, well, but if you say no enough, they go away. This is the way it is. So, it isn't. Will it drive policies with regard to kids? I don't know, maybe, but that's
even adults. I heard something in this might have been a conspiracy thing, but they were saying like, oh, you might not be able to get your driver's license unless you show vaccination records or something. So there is. I think it's a little further out and a little harder to enforce and push than the stuff with kids, but people do talk about it, trying ways to enforce it for adults.
Well, they were talking about immunity certificates, and that might be based more on antibody analysis than, like I say, I think the vaccine target audience is really the people who can't afford the native exposure. So who knows, maybe they'll have to have something like that, or it's really weird because I'm a libertarian, so I dislike anything that gets in the way of my own civil rights. I don't want to tell you what to do, and I would greatly appreciate it if you don't tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. That's my theory. And we have certain groups of people who sort of get away with the Amish or the Hasidics. They don't do any of this stuff. So, I mean, it's hard to say what this will do for constitutional rights, but there's enough nut jobs in this world who will picket the White House at the first sign that there's anything that approaches a vaccine mandate. You can sit back and relax. They'll do it for you. There's enough nut jobs out there that'll take care of all that for us. That's the one thing about this country is you can find a couple of crazy people, for almost anything. So you say to yourself, I mean, it's like I put a lot of trust in the fact that nothing here ever gets done without a whole bunch of people protesting it one way or the other. I mean, I sat back on that whole vaccine thing, and it was like, it was like watching two scorpions in a bottle. It's like, what, and not really caring, who killed who. Got a question there, Sarah Zara?
I'm always full of questions. Nope. I guess a comment. Dr. Fratellone lectured us 2 weeks ago and talked about a vaccine because he's volunteering on the front lines of ER hospitals in New York City. And he said they're pushing one out by September, and he was extremely fearful of it. And he's not like an anti-vaxxer, but he was extremely fearful because he thinks that we truly will be the test subjects if you choose to get the vaccine, if it comes out in September, because it won't be sufficiently tested.
I don't think there's a chance of an icicle in hell of a vaccine being released by September.
Me too.
I mean, it just you couldn't convince a company to assume that degree of liability. So in essence, basically.
But aren't vaccine companies not liable anymore?
Well, they do have to contribute to the fund that pays people out who have claims. So if you can imagine that all of a sudden they rush out a vaccine and it turns out that it paralyzed, that 10 million people get Guillain-Barré or Barré or whatever that is, the company would be out of business. It'd be in Chapter 11. So, you have to be very careful when you listen to news and media, because their job is to condition you for the eventual subsequent bad news that they're going to give you in the near future. So everything is about preparing you for the next piece of bad news. And this is largely because most of these news companies and politicians just don't give credit for people as being as smart or as self-interested as they are, or else they would have been much more honest about masks, and they would have been much more likely to tell people to go isolate, sooner. But they all thought the American public wouldn't stand for it. But then they looked up and the American public was doing it already, and they hadn't even made the announcements, because the American public would like to live. And after a while, you just stop believing people. So if you look at that kind of thing, and I have no idea what Patrick is talking about vaccine-wise, that's something that's going to be here in a couple of months. But again, it's really, I don't think anybody is talking about making this a sort of societal vaccine, simply because for a good 55% of the population, it's a mild to moderate influenza type illness. So like I say, it falls for me clearer on the realm of a kind of a, it eventually will be a type of a flu vaccine type thing. And, at that point, and then think about the consequences of looking at it from that perspective, because who gets the flu vaccine? Geezers. Why do geezers get the flu vaccine? Because they're the people who die from the flu, right? So do you get a flu vaccine when you're 30 years old? Some people do, because they don't want to miss work. All right. But the person who gets a flu vaccine to not die is your emphysemic grandmother, because they're going to have the comorbidities that are going to give them the flu fatality. So it's a really not a stretch to just think of this as a sort of an analogous to that, because the same population that's basically going to get it are really quite identical, and really for the same reasons. You get the flu vaccine if you're old and infirm, because if you get the flu, there's a good chance it can kill you, and that's exactly how this plays out. So I don't know if that was an answer or not. Jalen, ask me a question.
Okay. So when you were talking about quercetin and Chinese skullcap combination helping with the zinc fluctuation inside the cytoplasm, when would you start that kind of procedure? Even at like stage 1, I would think, because
mild influenza.
Okay.
Yeah. In other words, I think I got it. I've got 102-degree fever for 2 or 3 days. I have a persistent sore throat, maybe a dry cough. If you'll know something's rotten in Denmark.
Yeah.
And then basically at that point, you go into, for instance, that's kind of the same thing with stinging nettle and stuff. It doesn't really have preventative effects, preventive effects. So these are things that would go into the realm of the next step. In other words, these are things that are going to hopefully modulate the course of the illness. Keep it mild.
And this might be a weird question, or like a general question. Is there anything that you could do to, I feel like I know the answer already, but anything to increase your oxygen saturation levels? Like I know breathing and breathing exercises and exercising probably would increase it, but it would have to be your hemoglobin picking up the oxygen kind of thing.
Right. I mean, the things that would be likely to do that would be, I think you guys did some reading about haptoglobulins and those kind of things that were part of the polymorphisms, but your best thing there is vitamin C by far.
Okay. Yeah,
so you could look at that. There's other things, but they're not as well studied. But vitamin C, because of its redox potential, is really the strongest indicator there. And I mean, you could look at other elements as well that might play into this. Obviously, you'd want to see to adequate amounts of iron and copper. The other things that would be involved is hematinics. Good question. Emily, you have a question? I'll let you go on the dimer one because you already asked the question.
No, I'm just kind of soaking.
I have a follow-up.
A follow-up?
If someone has antibodies, can they donate so that other people can utilize the antibodies as treatment?
Plasma, right?
Yeah, that's called convalescent plasma therapy, and it's being used at 2 New York hospitals. It's as old as the hills.
Isn't it working?
I just saw. I mean,
it didn't work in one case who was in severe straits. But if you remember early part of the talk today, I said that there's not a lot of evidence that antivirals work in the late stages of this anyway. So convalescent plasma would be an antiviral at that point. When you're starting to get into septic shock and organ failure, that's no longer a problem related to the activity of the virus. It's a whole different thing altogether. So yes, that's that's been used. Certainly, it was even used during the Spanish influenza. They took convalescent serum and used it. It's not without its risks. Obviously, human plasma contains all sorts of nitty-gritty things that may or may not be filterable, viruses and other things. It was used. Passive immunotherapy was used in the early days of AIDS because they didn't have helper cells, and so they weren't getting a lot of plasma cell activity, and they weren't making a lot of antibodies. So the opportunistic infections were basically a problem, and so healthy serum from a non-HIV donor was full of all sorts of antibodies, and they would get this passive immunotherapy for a while, and then after that would last about a month or two, and they'd have to get it again. All right, I'm going to sign off at this point. I hope this was helpful, and let's plan on one more of these.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to
Thank
see you.
you.
Have a
Stay
good night.
safe, guys.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.